Welcome to Unlearning Labels. Today, we are bringing you an interesting topic, which apparently is being talked about in real life. Mira and Peter were at an event this morning and it came up. And I just want to begin with a disclaimer to be clear, even though the topic actually is masculinity redefined. These are traits that can show up in men as well as women who are leaders. So, what did you hear this morning? Tell me about it.
Just that people are actually aware of it, which is good. And there was both male and females at this event, right? And it was a tech startup community type thing called Silicon Alley. We can give them a name check because it was actually really good. And we just got talking about various topics. People were asking us what we did and vice versa. And I can't remember how we got onto the topic, but we were talking about, the kind of behaviors that leaders can display. And the reality is, and quite often in startups, it is quite male heavy, let's be honest.
Yes, it
On the
is.
tech side, it's usually, quite white male, that kind of thing. And I was
At least in
chatting.
Europe, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like in America, it's kind of Indian male. Yeah, in the tech area. Yeah.
No, we were just talking about, the good and bad of behavior in terms of leadership, and sometimes male toxicity can, seep into certain behaviors. So, for example, you're in a meeting, and I had this actually from a female senior leader that will remain nameless, but I will say that she told me to man up. And this is a classic, actually. So it's a good segue into what we're talking about, because it was, a female counterpart, one of my colleagues who's more senior than me, saying, "Peter, you're too emotional. Just man up."
Wow.
And I'm like, wow, okay, that's what do we do with that kind of feedback,
Yeah. So what I think has happened is because we had this, the patriarchal, is am I pronouncing it right? Leadership style over the hundreds and hundreds of years, and so I think, and with that comes, because there were mainly men, at least in the society that we know, there have been these traits, certain masculine traits that were connected with leadership. And so when we talk about leadership a lot these days, not these days, but now we're becoming more aware of it, and we are understanding that it doesn't have to be that way in order to be a good leader, in order to be a leader, not good leader, to be a leader. And so
yeah, that's a different show.
we've noticed that actually lots of these traits, masculine traits, are over there. If you want to be a leader, you need to be like this, you need to be like this, you meant to be like this. And so it's and I think this is why, one of the reasons why we are talking about in this context right here, right now. But it's interesting to me, and I kind of wanted to go with the because I think what it's said over there is that masculinity is a thing. You're a man, you're a masculine, or you have to be masculine, otherwise you're not a man. And it actually has nothing to do with reality. It's social construct. Those are some ideas that some powerful people have put over there, but it doesn't mean it's true. And the same is for leadership. There are some ideas about leadership over there, but they're not true. And so I think in order to be better leaders, in order to be better humans, and in order to be better for themselves, because ultimately, it's not that we are just hurting people around ourselves behaving in that way, but we are hurting ourselves and trying to live up to idea of society that in order to I need to be masculine, I need to have certain traits that are true for my society or for my group, and I don't feel like that, it means that I'm not okay. And that's just absolutely not true. It's utter nonsense.
Rubbish. Yes.
I was about to say, the word that you shouldn't be saying online.
Bullshit. Like, beep.
And
There we
so-
go. Thank you. See? And
so,
true masculine style.
yeah, in true masculine style. Yeah. And so it is interesting that it's a social construct. It's an idea. It's not the thing, and it's not something that you should or shouldn't be.
Yeah.
So to be clear, I mean, like, are you saying, Mira, that if you display emotions, or Peter, if you're expressing affection or compassion for your team, this is not an acceptable leadership or masculine trait? Is that what you're both saying, or that what you've heard or have observed is the norm?
Well, like I say, I've experienced it throughout my career because I'm a man. I've heard it from my colleagues, my own team members, other male counterparts, and then, like I say, sometimes female leaders, because maybe they're aware, maybe they're not. I couldn't say in the moment, but unbeknown to them, it looked to me like they were just copying the behavior of their male counterparts, and that's what made sense to them to get higher up the ladder and get promoted and stuff like that. But I can honestly say that really confused me, and it made me feel like, whoa, hold on a minute, I am a man, I don't need to man up, I think I'm doing a good job, and this is really useful feedback as an example, right? And actually I took that harder than I did from my male counterparts, funny enough, who, for example, back in the day I was in the sales team, and they were like, take one for the team, be a man, this kind of, again, toxic behavior. But again, if you think about the way that we've all been brought up, it's always been in there, systemic of society. So, for example, what made us talk about this topic as well, just so for people watching and hearing, we read a book by an author called J.J. Bowler. And this was about a month ago. We were at a book festival, and just by luck, the author was actually on a panel. And the panel was actually talking about masculinity. What is this, And so we were lucky enough to get in there, watch the panel, and it really, really was very insightful for me. And it was really good to hear, because I was kind of like, sitting there going, finally, another male saying this. And it's not that I hadn't heard other males say that. I've said this out loud. We talk about this with our clients and stuff like that. But there's so many topics within society, within the place of work, within leadership, where it's always at play, this male patriarchy. So it's quite hard to explain. I mean, I'm no expert, but that the patriarchy bit is, as Mira pointed to, it's society, kind of the norms, the social norms that have always been there, and people just don't question it because they're uncomfortable. And there's power structures that, let's be honest, they do exist in the world of work, especially in corporate America and Europe and global companies, where there's a power structure where the males get a lot of good stuff. For example, one thing, I don't want to veer off, but pay is usually a hot topic, where I quite often coach female CEOs for, say, the EU, and we talk about pay scales and stuff like that, and it's way off. If you're a female in certain circles, depending on industry, it can be a massive gap between what you get paid for doing exactly the same work, if not better work, but you're actually getting maybe even 20% less, which is kind of shocking, right?
Well,
and it's stuff
I'm going to get back to your pay comment, but what is the name of the book? I do want to put that in the comments. Is it Man in the Mirror?
Mask Off.
Mask Off. Okay.
Yeah, Mask Off.
Okay.
Sorry, Mask Off, and then Masculinity Redefined.
Yeah, that's a subtitle.
By J.J. Bowler. Yeah.
Okay. So, in America, it's actually more skewed than that. It's, what is it? It depends, right? So Mira would probably get 80 cents on the dollar. I would probably get closer to 58 cents on the dollar. And then there's, in between that, Other groups of women would get a variation somewhere between the 58 and the 83 cents. Um, you know, and 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 it has nothing to do with actual skill set. And in some cases, I think the phrase should be woman up, right? Because women, because of their compassion, tend to be a little bit stronger. But women that are more leaning into their masculine, their masculine energy will be crushed just like a man, and I can just speak from my own perspective. So like early in my career, I when I was working in law firms and on Capitol Hill, there's a lot of pressure to be like a leader, like male leaders, and that taking on that toxic masculine energy really crushed my soul, and it's very stressful. So I know on this podcast on Learning Labels, we talk a lot about self-awareness and the importance of self-care as a leader. And so just in the interest of your well-being, this is another reason to redefine. And I think like as we go along, let's kind of pull out like what those top three attributes would be that could make the load a little bit lighter in redefining what is masculinity.
Well, I think from my side, being a male, right? So I'll just share a bit from my experience that being a male is, from where I'm sitting, it can be challenging, because society expects a certain thing from me, society and the people around you. And it took me years working on myself and being a coach and all of that to realize that, as JJ Bowler's quoting in this book, and he said on the panel, I really resonate with this, that masculinity is basically made up. It's a narrative. It's something that we are told, we grow up, and it could be our parents, it could be someone in school, it could be society in general that tell you you have to act or be a certain way. But more often, especially in the last decade, I've noticed that masculinity is whatever I want it to be, being a male. And where people are free to be like that. And again, it's not easy because I don't always feel free 24/7. It depends. It's situational. I feel very free right now. I felt very free this morning, for example. Then there could be a group mentality where I'm just with a load of males, and innocently or not, they will act up in a certain way. And then I'll get really uncomfortable because they'll want to be acting in a certain way that, again, it's that male toxicity. It's been really hyper masculine. Oh, I'm a male and all of that. And it just doesn't make sense to me now. And I find it quite funny. So one example that Mira knows about, we talked about before recording, was that, for example, Mira's niece painted my fingernails, as one example. And I'm totally fine with that. I don't mind having nail varnish on. Okay, I'm a musician as well. So maybe that's quite normal for people to do that. But actually, the more I've noticed, on the nail varnish topic, quite often I see lots of males with a few fingers painted. But some people are really reactive to that, and I can think of certain people that if I was in that group, they'd be like, are you gay? They'd say like, are you a real man? Why have you got your fingers painted? It's stuff like that. And I'd be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. It's just a fingernail. What's the big deal? And if I want to have a fingernail that's painted a certain color, what's the problem with that? And actually, wasn't it JJ Bowler that said he come up with this really good question? So it was like a non-violent way of communicating and saying, what do you mean by that? But not doing it in an aggressive male way. It's kind of like, well, if someone says, oh, you're not being a man, it's a really good response to come back and say, well, what do you actually mean by that? I'm just curious. And I'm in a playful mood. And, quite often that can disarm someone and go, maybe that wasn't the best thing to say.
Yeah, it makes them think what actually is a real man. So it's interesting to me to see that masculinity, and I think where it gets toxic, it's connected with power, with anger, with being strong emotionally. I mean, being strong emotionally, like
Or like being like
emotions.
emotionless.
Yeah, which is it's impossible, it's inhumane. So you kind of, you're denying yourself to feel certain things, and then we do, and because of it, and that's why we say let's redefine it. Because of it, we have really, really high percentage of male population committing suicides or trying to commit suicides.
Yeah, because they've got no outlet for emotions. I mean, I've spent most of my adult life really struggling with that, if I'm honest. And even now, sometimes I feel like I can't really cry. I do cry more
Even
often.
when me and Mira pick on you.
Yeah.
Often I cry when that happens.
After this conversation.
Yeah. But it's interesting that I'm okay getting tearful in front of other males. I would never be able to do that decades ago, for sure. I would just be like, oh shit, I feel like I'm tearing up. And I remember welling up in work and hiding in the toilet, for example, when I worked in the telco, in early 2000s, because I was like, well, I'm a leader, I'm a man. I need, and this wasn't anyone else being toxic towards me. It was me inside of my head saying, man up, I can't cry in front of my team or whatever it was. So I just hid in the toilet, for example.
So see, again, soul crushing, even for males, to avoid showing emotion.
Did you also? Sorry, go on.
No, I'm just saying. So like, that's one thing right there. Like just normalizing that humans have emotion is a way to redefine it. Yeah.
I mean, sorry.
Sorry. I was just going to say, did you see? So it was Roger Federer, and Federer, for anyone, I mean, I'm not a massive tennis fan, but I know that Federer quite often cries. He wins, he cries, he loses, he cries. It's cool, He is what he is. He embraces himself, and he's just being, which is great. But he kind of gets away with it, not to blame him, because he's a sportsman,
Well, I mean, McEnroe got away with being a complete jerk for ages, right? Because that's what a man's supposed to be. So that's
aggressive,
right.
shouting,
Yes.
violent, throwing tennis rackets at umpires and whatever, and yeah, I mean, as a kid, it's a good example, actually. Well done, because watching that as a kid, that looked to me like that's what it's okay to be like that. And going back to Federer, so who's the Spanish tennis player?
Nadal.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a really good picture, if you saw it in the media, where Nadal and Federer, what?
It was everywhere.
Yeah, and they were holding hands and consoling each other, and they were both having a bit of a cry, and it's great to see. But again, if they weren't sports people, I'd hazard a guess that would be like, whoa, what are they doing?
Well, or if this had been the 70s and the 80s when we were growing up.
Yeah. I mean, the world is changing, and it's pretty amazing. And I'm really happy to see that. Elizabeth said emoting is not professional. Yeah, and it's not professional for men and for women, and it's really interesting, because I mean that's something that we were talking about quite recently, wasn't it? Somewhere, I don't know where we were talking about it. Is that you actually cannot, a few minutes back, we cannot make decisions without emotions, and so it's always happening, isn't it? And so if you're not aware of your emotions, or you're bottling your emotions, they're going to come up in making your decisions. And so if you're aware, if you're allowed, to feel them, your decision making is going to be much better. So it's interesting.
Well, I can tell you, being a male and being deeply emotional in my roles over the years. I mean, luckily for me, I'm quite strong-willed, although it really
is stubborn.
Yeah, I am stubborn. And, sometimes I was too stubborn in roles, and, it got me into trouble. Hence why I wasn't the CEO of these companies. But quite often I would get bullied by quite often powerful female leaders who felt like they needed to crush me and say, hey, Peter, you're too emotional in the meetings. And that happened a lot. And like I say, it kind of knocked me a bit sideways when it came from a female, even though it doesn't matter, gender aside, it's still wrong, wherever it comes from. But it got me curious. So in one of my last roles, it came up quite a lot. And what I noticed is, because I've been working on myself and studying psychology, and I'd already done certain coaching certifications, I was like, the more emotional I am, the more I embrace that, the more impact I have with my team. But paradoxically, the leadership team was saying the opposite, and they didn't like it. And the more emotional I got, and again, it wasn't like, just to give you an example, if I was bawling my eyes out in every meeting and shouting and being hyper emotional, that's not good. That's toxic as well. What I'm
Yes.
talking about is very subtle things where I would share how I felt, the impact of certain decisions on my team and the impact on my peers. And we would discuss these things in meetings, but it didn't get the airtime. And quite often it was cut off completely because some of my counterparts, both male and female, felt deeply uncomfortable because we were talking about emotion.
And I think that that might be the problem, is because we don't understand emotions. And I think we ourselves, as humans in society that we live in, we haven't learned how to process our emotions and how to, who be comfortable with our emotions. So when somebody around us feels emotion and shows it, we get uncomfortable. And I think that that's one of the big things. But I kind of wanted to look into a little bit about masculinity as a social construct. And because it's a social construct, um, it's it's different in different societies. And so what's considered masculine in one society isn't considered masculine in the other society. And I'm not saying that all of it is toxic. It's just that it's really interesting how we consider some things as not appropriate, and in another society it's considered appropriate.
Yeah. So, for example, when we lived in, in the Middle East, quite often it was normal, depending on the country, where men would hold hands. And it got me curious because I wasn't used to that where I grew up, because I grew up in a, for better or worse, not a very touchy-feely society, even in my own family. And again, if my family listening to this, or they ever listen to it, I'm not blaming anyone. It is what it is. As you pointed to before, Cordelia, 70s and 80s was a different place. There was a lot less emotion from a lot of the father figures and male role models in my life, for example. And I don't blame these people, but they grew up in a certain way as well. They had an experience and they were told to act and be a certain way. And then that obviously got in the way for me or anyone else that was male in that community to feel safe, because it was constantly, I have to live up to something that I didn't agree to.
So is it like
Yeah.
you just said something, and is it that when we feel unsafe, that we are going towards these behaviors that we perceive as more acceptable
Yep.
in
I
certain
I
constructs?
would
And then
agree with that, because it feels like the conditioning, right? When we're uncomfortable, we go to our default setting, which is the conditioning that we grew up with, right? So I've recently become aware, like in Japanese companies, right? They keep all the decision making within the top leadership, and then they disseminate it without any input from, the lower level managers, right? And that is considered strength. In the West, right? It's very patriarchal, like you were saying before, where it just locks women out completely. So even if you're in a room full of managers, and maybe a third of the managers are women, they're not going to even ask, right? What, or unless that woman really puts herself in the mix, and then she'll be bullied, just like Peter was, but different. It's like, aren't you a cheeky, beep?
but it's really interesting. And is it because we really don't want to ask anybody, or is it because we think that we should know everything? And this is where I think this toxicity comes in, that men in this, or in general, are under pressure to perform. And masculinity that we are talking about, the toxic part of masculinity, is pressure to perform, to deliver a performance, and it is to behave in a certain way that, is considered acceptable, and then I'm okay.
Well, I would say it's a pressure to live up to something that's made up, that doesn't
Yeah.
exist. I mean, the power structures exist, that's for sure. But the more conversations I have with other males and females and anyone in between, whatever gender you identify with, I'm like, how do you see masculinity? And it's always very different. And that's what warms my heart, because it is in the eye of the beholder. And for example, if I think back at this panel we were watching, there was one author that, looks like a normal stereotypical male in terms of dress code, and then the guy in the middle was wearing bright red lipstick and quite flamboyant and openly, out there, out and proud. And then there was a female she was a strong female character, an activist, right? And it was interesting that they all had a different take on it, but because they weren't trying to sell it or align anyone else to fit a mold, it completely works. And that's the way I see it now, that, it is whatever it is for that person. If they feel comfortable wearing certain clothes, they want to be a certain, act or, exist in a certain way, then that's totally fine. The tricky thing is, though, that even now, society's not quite ready for that. I mean, we live in Berlin, right? So we live in one of the most open cities in the world. And to be fair, you can pretty much get away with being whoever you want here within reason. But there's many places around the world that just would not be possible. And
but even here, like, that's fine in clubs, but even here, when you go to the office, you need to,
of course,
be a certain way, or you need to leave the part of yourself somewhere else.
And what do you think of dress code? I mean, was it Virgin Atlantic? I don't want to advertise their airline, but I found it really interesting that they suddenly changed the cabin crew clothes, and regardless of what gender you are, you can wear whatever you want out of that selection of clothes.
What do you mean? They were wearing red the last time I saw.
Yeah. But so now I think they have red and black. And so, you could, there are, but it doesn't, I think, as much as I understood, that the clothes, the uniforms that they have are not gender assigned. So you can,
So a man can wear a skirt?
I think so, yeah.
Oh,
yeah. And so it's and then different colors, a woman can be in black, or a man can be in red, or it's so I think that they allow this freedom to choose
what a subtle nuance, when we're talking about the dress code, right? I mean, like, as far as an actual uniform for the company, are there any other companies that are allowing that you're aware of?
Heard of?
There are out there. I don't want to name some of them because I don't know the full details. I mean, I've worked for companies where they've been pretty open. They didn't really say that it has to be gender specific, but actually, when I think about it, quite often as a leader in these companies, I was told to give feedback to my male counterparts for wearing, dare I say, more feminine clothes, if that makes sense. And it did happen from time to time. And the way I dealt with it was that, honestly, I said, I don't mind. It doesn't affect me. I'm just curious, what's your reaction and why? I just want to understand it, because I can't just suddenly go up to a person and tell them not to wear a certain item of clothes unless I know there's a good reason. Is it against the company dress code, for example? But quite often when I worked in these larger corporate structures, the dress code was quite a big gray area, and
but it's interesting, and I think it's also, I mean, we talk about masculinity, I think it's also with femininity, or is that the word?
Yeah, femininity. Yeah.
And I've found myself lately going for meetings and meeting clients, and I would be, okay, today I've got a jumper and I'll be in trousers. And before I would think about, what shoes to wear. Now I'm going in sneakers.
That's
Because
the
it's really
trend, though.
comfortable. No, but this is very comfortable to me, and so I think it's something that it's changing, and so I don't need to look certain way in order to be myself. I don't have to do certain things in order to be myself. And I think in the same way as masculinity in the same way femininity can be toxic if we need to be look certain way, talk certain way, in order to appear okay.
So basically, we've been talking about dress code, emotions, what again? I guess taking turns in speaking. And we've been demonstrating that quite well during this conversation. We just talk all over each other today. No. That was quite intentional.
Okay.
Well, I know not to cross you two too often.
Yeah, because we've got all this toxic masculinity between the two of us. So
you might give me feedback that I'm too emotional during the show.
What would be the things that we particularly see in companies that comes from masculinity, and it's quite toxic to both men and women, like some ideas, beliefs, traits?
Well, I quite often see male leaders having to be shouty and all of this stuff, and to be powerful. And it's less and less, which is great. That really does warm my heart, because it's less acceptable to get away with that. And I'd like to hope that, if your boss suddenly starts shouting at you and really bullies you, then, eventually that has to be course corrected and HR would step in and all of that. But the challenge is that it is very industry specific. And I know of industries where it's still the norm. Your boss is allowed to swear at you and threaten you and all of that, and it's just accepted as part of the factory floor, even though it's not a factory. I've seen it going everywhere. And
well, one of the things that we talked about was pulling up a list. So like I have the list in front of me. So for masculine, like you said, aggressive, independent, unemotional, objective.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Unimpressionable. That means they can't be impressed. They can't be changed easily. And active, competitive, easy to make decision. I have to laugh at that one. Not offended, and speculative, less attention for self-appearance. And by contrast, right? High attention for self-appearance, non-speculative, offended, dependent, difficult to make decisions, uncompetitive, passive, impressionable, subjective, emotional, dependent is here twice, and unaggressive. And I would have to say, at least from the places that I've been at, many of the women that I know, they actually have all of those masculine traits, which we've all said throughout this conversation are toxic.
Well, you know what? It's interesting you say that, because most of our work, when we work with female leaders, especially, CEOs, really senior ones, is to slow them down enough to see the impact of their own behavior. Because, we could just say, hey, you're being really masculine in the way you approach it, but that really isn't going to work. The best way to do is slow them down and say, hey, how do you act in a certain scenario? It's asking them the right questions and then getting the answers back and saying, okay, well, the impact of your answers are that if you behave in that way in a meeting, it will be perceived as like this. And actually, so I'll give you one example where quite often I've seen female leaders that I've been supporting feel like they need to act exactly the same as the pack, which is usually predominantly male. And my feedback was that, and this is just my take on it as a coach, is that if you want to have real impact, then go the opposite of the way the shoal's swimming, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You can be the same person in the room, so the shouting and aggression and all of that, and suddenly you're just the voice of reason, and you can have massive impact by the less is more approach, right?
Yeah.
And the more leaders that step up that way, the better results, no surprise. And actually, they're the ones that people remember, because there'll be a shout match, and all of a sudden, person X says one thing with impact, and everyone's just like, wow, okay. Because they're not really trying to be something that they're not. They're not trying to copy toxic behavior. They're really just listening to understand what's going on. And they're trying to, well, not trying, they're actually doing a good job of actually course correcting it. You probably heard the term, Cordelia, we say this often to clients, that be the same person in the room. So if there's loads of headless chickens and everyone's bouncing off the walls, be the person that does the opposite and maybe just throw a question in to reset the room, And that's kind of the opposite of that toxic behavior.
And it's interesting, that list that you just read. Oh my God, it's a really hard job. I mean, how much energy do we put into behaving or holding that appearance, performing that I always need to be decisive? I mean, sometimes you're not, sometimes you just don't know. It's just very human. And how many mistakes because of it, because you need to appear you're decisive, so you make decision rashly, hastily, even if you didn't know what to do. I always need to, I'm not impressionable. I'm not, all this. So there's so much energy in it. And if we could be, and sometimes we are this, and I believe that for some people have more clarity in certain areas, and some people have more clarity in other areas. So if we understood that masculinity, for example, has nothing to do with leadership.
Yeah.
And nothing to do with professional behavior.
Yeah.
And if we understood that, and we learned more about ourselves, it would be much easier to have a safe environment where everybody could contribute in much better decisions, and it would be so much less pressure on that one person.
Yeah, it won't be so soul crushing. So what I'm hearing is, if we were to redefine masculinity, it would be a strong safe space for people to feel at ease, deep listening, and around decision making. I guess that's also related to deep listening, right? So slowing down enough to be what is the word I'm looking for? When you slow down, and like if we normalize, you don't have to make a decision on the spot to make it seem like you're in charge, but rather you deliberate. That's you actually deliberate, instead of flying off the handle and making reckless decisions. So, I mean, those would be the top three quality. Those are the top three qualities that I'm hearing coming up in our conversation.
And the other thing that springs to mind, going back to this panel that we saw a couple of weeks back, was that, and I didn't see it this way, but I kind of resonate with it now, that masculinity, whether you're aware of it or not, it's seen as a performance, and it doesn't need to be. I mean, you can do that in a loving, playful way if you're being creative. Go for it. That's amazing, right? But quite often it's I mean, the reason why the book was called Mask Off, because it's wearing a mask of the expectation of everyone else but yourself.
Yeah.
And you're not serving anyone by doing that. And the more that you serve yourself by going, okay, well, masculinity to me is XXX, and I'm going to go and do this. Then companies, I mean, I don't have a silver bullet answer, but I'm guessing that, if you look at the psychological safety and diversity, for example, allowing people to be and feel whatever they want to in work, but obviously still being professional. And, if someone plays up and behaves in a certain way, then totally fine as a leader to step in and give feedback and have someone's back and help them correct that behavior if it's not conducive for them growing in the company, if it's deviating from what the company wants and all of that. But quite often that's not the problem. The issue is when leaders or anyone in the company, for example, because sometimes it's employees that cause the problem, even though they have a go at the leadership team. It's allowing, if you've got people in your team, it's allowing them to be whoever they are and listening to them and showing curiosity and really having the respect to understand who they are individually. And I think the more that we can teach employees and leaders and everyone to do that, then I think that's where you'll see amazing results. Because if people feel comfortable to just be themselves, there'll be less wearing of masks. It just won't make sense to go and play up to someone's toxic behavior, because you won't feel it. I mean, you're always going to feel uncomfortable in the world of work. It's going to happen, right? One day you're comfortable, one day you're not. It's normal. It's totally natural. But you'll feel less uncomfortable in a team where everyone's embracing that just natural diversity of whoever they are, and that's a tricky thing, because the world of work isn't quite ready for everyone just to be whoever they are. Let's be honest. And that's what we see. And the more that we encourage that, the better I would say that society will be, the better that company culture will grow. And I don't know what you two think
I
about.
think it will be less need for performance. And
Yeah.
everybody wants to be seen.
Yeah.
If you're not seen being who you are, you will try to be seen being who you're not,
Right.
So
But swapping out the performance for being curious, right? The
yeah,
performative,
that's the word that
yeah, for curiosity is a great remedy for
I think
that.
so, Cordelia. I mean, because what would you rather do? Perform and be someone that you're not, or just be deeply curious and get to learn lots of new, rich information, and probably learn a lot about yourself along the journey as well? Because I know that I can only speak for me being a male and talking about this. The more curious I was about other people and how they perceive themselves, and just embracing that and not judging. I'm sure that like anyone, I can be honest, when I didn't see it, I'm sure I was uncomfortable around certain people being flamboyant and being whoever they were. But the more I just leaned into that, I was like, okay, they're just being whoever they are. This is amazing. Whether I was uncomfortable or not, that's where the juice is for me, because then I'm not trying to change that person's behavior. I'm not acting in a certain way that makes them feel uncomfortable in the moment. Uncomfortable. And I think that's what the solution is, if that makes sense. Or at least that's what I see. I don't know.
But there is also another aspect of, it's not just men teaching men to be masculine, it's also women.
Yeah.
And there is a big role of, women being in the companies in leadership roles that do not adapt to that mask, do not start wearing that mask, but also women, there are different moving forward in leadership roles, not thinking that they have to be different in order to. And I think it's also the expectations of everybody around us. Oh, he is too emotional, he isn't a good leader, or he is, and I think we're all responsible for that change. I mean, it's just because you're uncomfortable around somebody who has emotions, it doesn't mean that emotions are wrong. For example, as one example of emotions, because I think it's often the, or he isn't a good leader because he hasn't made a decision instantly, or because he or she didn't know something, or
The other thing I hear as well is that we need more feminine energy in companies. And I'm not saying we don't, but here's my take on it. And I don't know what you two think of this, but feminine energy, again, it's made up. And now, because we're in a world where people are becoming a lot more self-aware about being whoever they are, there's no fixed point of view where it lies, you know. And that's why I think it's tricky when I see people saying, no, we just need more femininity. I'm like, no, we just need to allow people to be whoever the hell they are, whatever that may be. And that's moment to moment, just to be clear, because I don't see, you know, I'm guessing you two are the same, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've changed over the years. I've transformed, whether I like it or not. And my surroundings and, you know, for better or worse, things have changed. And it's never been a fixed point, but in society we're told to be, you know, here's a box and you neatly fit in it. But that's complete nonsense to me, and it doesn't make sense, because
Yeah.
there is no mold. You know, it's not about breaking the mold. There was never a mold in the first place, because we all made it up, and then some of it stuck, sadly, and that's where the patriarchy and the power structures lie, because we're still drip feeding people as children in the education system that there's a set way of being and you have to fit that particular mold depending on what you want to do in society.
I don't really know that it's still being so much drip fed in the education. It's trying, but there's so much dissent, you know, in the younger generation that it's not really getting any, it's not sticking, you know, but what I do see is this movement of compassionate leadership. I mean, there have been several books. One of our mutual, you know, connections, Heather Younger wrote that book. Was it Caring Leadership? A couple of years back. And so there is a movement towards that. And I think in that book, she actually interviewed a fair amount of male leaders. So the movement towards being more compassionate and allowing the consideration of human emotion in decision making is making headway. However, back to what we've been talking about this whole conversation, what we see with our clients, right? The female leaders we work with, is they're so conditioned, like in this box, that they have to show up a certain way and perform a certain way, that, you know, we almost have to coach them to be human again. It's like, oh, no, you don't have to do that. You can just be who you are. And what I'm also seeing is like, some of the policies are, okay, we want you to be more of a caring leader. We want to see more expressive and be more of who you are. But if people are from a certain generation, they're just not going to let it go, because that conditioning is really, really deep, you know? So I think what needs to happen is that we have to normalize that it's okay to just be human, you know, and it's okay that we all have emotions, and it's okay to take 24 to 48 hours to make decisions and deliberate and consider what everybody thinks on the team sometimes, you know, because decision-making fatigue is a thing, and people are dropping dead from it, or just, you know, or I don't know what you're seeing. I haven't had any clients die on me yet, but
yeah.
Oh, I don't mean that.
No, but it does add to lots of stress.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, remember I spoke to a CEO of an insurance company in the UK when we were doing some research, and he said something really interesting, which I've heard other very senior people say, that, you know, I'm getting paid the big bucks and there's a lot of pressure and all of that stuff, but I'm not complaining, because I just know that there's certain huge decisions that I'll make, maybe 2, 3, or 4 maximum a year, where they're huge and there's a lot of pressure, and I'm not going to just run into that blindly. You know, I need to check in with people, get advice, think about it, reflect on it. And this one particular person said, actually, when I didn't do that and I had a sense of urgency, or felt the pressure of the company, or, you know, and he said, actually, it was usually just my own worst enemy, of me pressurizing myself, you know, man up, why can't I make a decision, or whatever it was, right?
Yeah.
But it was interesting that He said, the more that I just, reflected and got some advice and pushed back, he said, I still felt deeply uncomfortable because I had people above me saying, hey, I want that decision yesterday. What the hell are you playing at? And he was like, well, you're going to have to wait because I haven't made my decision yet. So back off. And
And
I thought that
that's
was really
leadership.
interesting.
And that
Yeah.
is leadership.
Nice.
That's leadership right there. And obviously there are times when sitting on your hands and not making a decision, that's obviously not going to be serving people or the company well, but we're not pointing to that. It's where with confidence, it's a place of clarity. You're deciding because there's certain options you want to think about or reflect on, because the decision has implications both towards your employees, financially, to the board, all of these things. So quite often in the world of work right now, because we're in a hyper fast society, everyone wants things done yesterday. And it's good to know that there are still leaders out there that get that, very senior people who are like, no, I'm going to take a stand. And this has been a torchbearer and a good example and role model for the rest of your team, the rest of the leadership team, the rest of the company, to show that if you're willing to be transparent as well, because you can't share everything, right? But when certain key decisions are made, it's to go back and have town halls and share that and say, hey, we had a tough time. I was at a crossroads and this happened. And the more that leaders step up and do that in a professional way and share what they can when they can, because I know you can't be transparent with everything, it just sets the bar much higher, And I'd guess that better decisions are made, and there will be times when you just know that that's the right decision and you don't have to think about it or get advice or reflect on it, and you just know and you do that. That's okay too.
No, it's I think the whole concept is really interesting. It's just to see, and I think the whole point of the conversation is to see of how much this made up masculinity of I need to be this in order to be okay or to be accepted or to be part of the group is coming into and affecting our lives regardless of whether we men or women or however we declare ourselves. Or so it's a really interesting one, and understanding it as a construct. It has nothing to do with your sex.
No.
Yeah.
Absolutely nothing. Yes, men have bigger muscles than women, but not all men.
Not all men.
I've seen women that are naturally very masculine. And so see where the concept of masculinity comes it from the muscle. But it's nothing to do with.
And you can see the danger when people innocently say stuff.
Power.
And, there's books about it where it's like, we just need female energy because that's the answer. It's not. It's just that we need, as you pointed to, Cordelia, it's being more compassionate, more considerate, and more curious about each other's humanity, and just to be whoever you are. But again, that doesn't mean that you don't care about, the company and the rules and the KPIs and all of the things that are in place. Far from it. It just means that you're allowed to feel safe. You're included. You're listened to. You feel part of something bigger than yourself. And the only way you can do that is if you're allowed to be whoever the hell you are, right?
Yeah. And it begins with self-awareness. So this has really been a powerful discussion, and thank you. I'm glad we did talk about this. I like your point about transparency, Peter, but I think that's a different show too, because people do struggle with that. But I think that was a great summary between the two of you, because it was so funny. I was about to say, so Peter, Mira, who wants to close us out? And you both did just a beautiful, masterful job as always. So
thank you
it's very kind.
It's very true.
I think we have a very interesting. I think we have a very interesting three of us. Interesting. I wouldn't say it an energy, but interesting dynamics in between us. And I think it's because we actually have created very quickly, very easily a safe space to talk about stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's,
And we have balanced energy, right?
yeah, but it's just an ebb and flow of naturally where it goes, right? Without us, I mean, we still feel uncomfortable sometimes, but that's okay. And it's just that ebb and flow of where it goes and not getting in the way of it. And I'd love to see more companies allowing that energy just to flow wherever it does, and for them to just explore, how does that look like? If people are really free to be whoever they are, what are the implications of that? Because honestly, I can't see anything negative, because we're not saying just do whatever you want. That's not what we're saying.
Right. And
We're
you
just
know,
saying,
that's what I say on the Free to Be show. I was like, being free is, to be clear, it's not being recklessly just doing whatever you want. It's being so purely aligned if we're talking about a company, everyone is so purely aligned with the mission and the vision that everyone feels safe and free to be themselves and go towards the goals and values and objectives. So
you know what? Maybe that's a good idea to do one on the purpose, the mission, the value, and maybe talk about culture, because I see that one as a tricky topic as well. We were, funny enough, we were discussing that this morning, that company culture is like grabbing clouds. If you ask 10 different employees, they'll all have a different take on what that culture is versus what the CEO said top down. But yeah, that's for another day. So yeah.
it is.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. And for our viewers and listeners that
Thanks for watching and listening.
watch and listen on the replay, we will be looking back at your comments. So thank you. And until next month, bye for now.
Bye.